There is a kind of silence that follows a truth spoken too late to matter and too early to be believed. He stood in the small study at Caldwick Hall with a single sheet of paper in his hand, his own handwriting looking back at him like the hand of a stranger who happened to share his name. Somewhere below, servants were arranging chairs for a wedding that had, technically, already happened once. "I don't remember choosing you," he said, to the woman standing very still in the doorway, not because he needed to say it, but because she deserved to hear him say it plainly. "But I have read enough tonight to know that I did, freely, before any of this. And if a man is fortunate enough to fall in love with the same person twice, in two different lives, I would be a fool to let the second time pass him by. Only weeks earlier, neither of them could have imagined what it would take to arrive at that sentence. Their marriage had nearly unraveled in a drawing room, while a cousin's quiet ambition deepened every doubt between them. In the end, it would be a locked drawer that finally answered the question neither of them had known how to ask. What mattered now was this. The paper in his hand was proof of something he could not remember feeling, and felt anyway, entirely, standing there. 6 weeks earlier, none of this would have made sense to him. 6 weeks earlier, he did not know her name. 6 weeks earlier, Gideon Vane, Duke of Rothermere, did not know her name. Because 6 weeks earlier, he had ridden out to the northern boundary of his own land to settle a dispute about a fence line, and had come home on a cart instead of a horse. It was a stupid way for a man to nearly die. He would think that later, when he had the strength to think anything at all, that after 31 years of surviving worse things than a badly placed rabbit hole, it was a fence line and a startled gelding that finally put him on the ground hard enough to crack something behind his eyes. The tenant who found him said afterward that his grace had simply stopped moving, that there was blood in the frost-hardened grass, and that the horse had stood over him the whole time as though it, too, could not quite believe what had happened. It was late February, the ground iron-hard and unforgiving, the kind of cold that made a fall worse than it might have been on softer ground in a kinder season. They carried him back to the house on a hurdle taken from a gate, 4 men walking as carefully as men can walk when they are frightened, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Whitlow, had the good sense to send a boy running ahead so that by the time they reached the door, there was already a bed prepared and a physician sent for from the nearest town of any size. He did not wake for 2 days. When he did wake, the first thing he understood was the ceiling, which was unfamiliar to him in a way that made no sense, because it was his own ceiling in his own bedchamber at Caldwick Hall, where he had slept every night of his life that mattered. The second thing he understood was pain, general and specific, radiating from somewhere behind his left ear. The third thing he understood was that there was a woman sitting very close to his bed, gripping the arm of her chair as though she had been holding on to it for a long time, and that he had absolutely no idea who she was. Gideon. She said his name like it cost her something to say it steadily. "Gideon, can you hear me?" "Yes," he said, because he could, and because his voice came out smaller and rustier than he expected. "Who?" He stopped. It seemed an unforgivably rude question to ask a woman who was looking at him the way she was looking at him, as though his eyes opening had personally spared her from something terrible. He tried again, more carefully. "Forgive me. I don't seem to recall your name." Her face did something complicated, not quite a flinch, more like a door closing very softly so as not to disturb the room. "Iris," she said. "My name is Iris." He waited for the rest of it, the context, the explanation, the reason this woman was sitting at his bedside with her knuckles white around a chair arm, But she offered nothing further, and something in her stillness told him not to ask for it yet. Instead, she rose quickly and went to the door and said something to someone he couldn't see. And within a few minutes, the room was full of people he mostly recognized, and one man in spectacles he did not, who introduced himself as Dr. Aldous Penn, and proceeded to hold a candle unnecessarily close to Gideon's eyes. The examination was thorough, and Gideon thought, needlessly indifferent to how much his head already hurt. Doctor. Penn asked him to state the year. Gideon stated it correctly and felt a small, foolish flicker of pride at having passed some kind of test. Dr. Penn asked him who currently sat on the throne. Gideon answered that too, with some irritation, and asked what any of it had to do with a fall from a horse. He was aware, distantly, of his mother standing very still near the window, and of the woman called Iris standing even more still by the door, neither of them quite breathing, both of them watching him answer questions as though the answers were the only thing holding up the room. Everything, as it happens, said Dr. Penn, and then asked him a third question, gently, in the voice of a man who had asked it before and dreaded asking it again. Your Grace, do you know who this lady is? Gideon looked again at the woman by the door, at Iris, he corrected himself, holding the unfamiliar shape of the name in his mind, and felt the first cold understanding that something was deeply, structurally wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the ache behind his ear. She told me her name, he said slowly. She did not tell me why she is here. The room went very quiet. It was the Dowager Duchess, standing near the window with her hands folded the way she folded them when she intended to remain composed, no matter what happened next, who finally spoke. Gideon, said his mother, that is your wife. He heard the words. He understood each of them individually, the way a man understands words in a language he has only half learned, recognizing the shapes, missing the sense underneath. Wife. His wife. This woman, whom he had never, as far as he knew, seen before in his life, standing in his bedchamber with her hands pressed flat against her skirts, as though that alone were keeping her upright. That isn't possible, he said, not unkindly, only factually, the way a man corrects an error in a ledger. I would remember marrying. Dr. Penn cleared his throat and explained, with the measured patience of a man who had read a great deal and witnessed very little, that this was not, in fact, unheard of, that a blow of sufficient force to one part of the head could, in rare cases, take with it a portion of a man's more recent memory, while leaving the rest of him entirely intact. Weeks, sometimes months. In severe cases, the doctor said, lowering his voice slightly, as though the words themselves might cause further damage. In severe cases, years. How many years, Gideon said, am I missing? Nobody answered immediately. Near the wardrobe, Gideon's valet, Simon Brady, had gone very pale and very quiet, the way a man goes quiet when he knows an answer, and has no right to be the one who gives it. It was Iris, his wife, apparently, a fact his mind kept setting down and picking back up, unable to find a place to rest it, who finally spoke, quietly, from the doorway, in a voice that was working very hard to sound unafraid. 3, she said. You are missing 3 years. 3 years. Long enough to build a life inside of. Long enough, evidently, to marry inside of. To move a stranger into his house and his name, and apparently his affections. none of which he could locate in himself no matter how carefully he searched. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time since waking, at the woman standing rigid by the door in a gown too plain for a duchess and too composed for someone whose entire world had, by every appearance, just been quietly dismantled, and he asked the only question that made any sense to him at all. "Who are you to me?" It was not unkind, the way he asked it. It was, if anything, the gentlest question in the room. But he watched it land on her like a physical blow, watched her absorb it and straighten under it, and understood, before he understood almost anything else about his own life, that he had just asked the single cruelest question a man could ask the woman who loved him, and that he had done it without any memory of ever having reason not to. The Dowager Duchess waited exactly as long as courtesy required, until Dr. Penn had gathered his instruments, and Gideon had been persuaded, with some difficulty, to close his eyes and rest. Before she drew Iris out into the corridor and said, in the low, reasonable voice she used for decisions she had already made, that perhaps it would be best for everyone if Iris removed herself to the Dower cottage for a few weeks. "For his peace of mind," Beatrice Vane said. "You saw how he looked at you, my dear, like a man being asked to solve a riddle he never agreed to. It is not cruelty on his part. It is simply a great deal, all at once, for a mind still healing." Iris had spent 3 days learning what it felt like to sit beside a man who might never wake, and in all that time, she had not once allowed herself to cry where anyone could see her do it. She did not cry now either. She only said quietly, "I understand your concern, Your Grace, but I am his wife. I intend to remain in my own home." "Of course you are his wife," said Beatrice, in the tone of a woman conceding a technicality while reserving every practical objection. "No one is disputing the fact of it. I am only suggesting that a fact, however true, is not always the kindest thing to press upon a man who cannot presently verify it for himself." It was, Iris thought, a remarkably elegant way of saying that her presence was an imposition. She did not say so aloud. She had learned in the 11 months of her marriage, 11 months that Gideon, apparently, could no longer account for, that Beatrice Vane's objections were rarely won by arguing with them directly. They were won, if they were won at all, by simply outlasting them. "I will stay out of his rooms unless he asks for me," Iris said. "I will not press him, but I will not leave Caldwick Hall, and I would ask that you not suggest it again in front of the household. It will only confuse the staff, and he needs the household steady around him more than he needs anything I might say or not say." Something moved behind the Dowager's composed face. Not quite respect, but its distant cousin, the beginning of an understanding that this daughter-in-law, whom Beatrice had never entirely approved of and had never quite managed to dislike either, was not going to be managed the way she had hoped to manage her. "As you wish," Beatrice said, and swept off down the corridor with the briskness of a woman who intended to write several letters before dinner. It was Mrs. Whitlow who found Iris some time later, standing in the small sitting room that adjoined her own bedchamber, staring at a shelf of books she did not remember choosing, in a room that was unquestionably hers, and yet, for the first time since she had come to Caldwick Hall as a bride, felt like someone else's entirely. "You'll want to eat something, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitlow said, setting down a tray without waiting for permission, the way she had done for 11 months, ever since the first week when Iris had gone 3 days forgetting to eat at all. And Mrs. Whitlow had quietly decided that this was a duchess who needed managing as much as any of the maids under her. Doctor says he'll likely sleep through till morning. Nothing to be done tonight, but rest yourself, and you're not much good to him worn to nothing. Thank you, Mrs. Whitlow. You needn't thank me. It's my work. The housekeeper busied herself unnecessarily with the tray, straightening a spoon that did not need straightening, and then, without quite looking up, said, "For what it's worth, Your Grace. And it's not my place to say it, so you may forget I said it at all. His Grace did not marry you because anyone made him. I was in this house before you came. I remember rather more of it than 3 years' worth." Iris felt something tighten in her chest, some old, careful wall going up out of habit before she had decided whether it needed to. "I know he was kind to marry me, Mrs. Whitlow. I have never mistaken kindness for something it wasn't." Mrs. Whitlow looked at her for a long moment, an odd, weighing look, as though she were deciding how much of a much longer sentence to say, and had decided finally to say none of it. "No," she said instead. "I don't suppose you have." And she left the tray and left the room, and Iris was too tired and too frightened to notice that she had been on the edge of hearing something true. She ate a little because it seemed important to do at least one ordinary thing. She thought, sitting there with the soup going cold, about the winter before her marriage, about her father's death and the debts that had come out from under the floorboards of his affairs, like water finding every crack in a hull. She thought of the letters from creditors that had stopped arriving only after her mother's cousin, in a fit of long overdue conscience, had mentioned Iris's situation to a duke who happened to be looking, that season, for a wife with no great fortune and no great ambitions of her own. He was a duke who wanted, or so everyone had assumed, a marriage of convenient arrangement rather than complicated affection, and who had found, in a gentry family drowning quietly and with excellent manners, exactly the kind of match that raised no awkward questions. She had gone into the marriage grateful. She had stayed in it over 11 months, increasingly something more than grateful, something she had been careful never to name too precisely, because naming it felt like asking for more than the arrangement had promised her. Gideon had never been cold to her. He had, if anything, been unexpectedly, disarmingly attentive in the quiet, unshowy way of a man who did small things and never mentioned them. But she had told herself over and over, in the small hours when the feeling threatened to become inconvenient, that gratitude was not the same as being wanted, and that a man who married to solve a problem might grow fond of the solution without ever having chosen it for its own sake. Now the problem, apparently, had grown legs and walked entirely out of his memory, and what remained was a man looking at her the way a stranger looks at a stranger. And Iris found, sitting alone with a tray she had barely touched, that she believed her own old explanation more thoroughly than she had believed it in months. Of course, this was how it would end, some small, tired, familiar voice told her. Of course, the debt of it would finally come due. She had always known, hadn't she, underneath the 11 months of small kindnesses, that she had married a solution to a problem, and that a man is not obligated to go on loving a problem once he has forgotten what the problem was. She did not examine that night why the thought of him forgetting hurt so much more than the thought of the debts ever had. Before she went to bed, she did one small, deliberate thing, more out of instinct than plan. She went to the estate ledger that sat, as it always did, on the writing desk in her sitting room. She had kept it without fuss since the 2nd month of her marriage, when she noticed the steward handling the household accounts rounded numbers in his own favor more often than chance could explain. So she had begun correcting them herself, a little each week, without making an occasion of it. She opened it now and made the week's entries by candlelight. Steady columns of ordinary figures, coal, wages, a repair to the east wall, because it was the one part of this house that still made sense to her. And because a woman who did not know what she would be to her husband in the morning could at least know what she was to his ledgers tonight. She did not know that Simon Brady passed the sitting room door on his way to check the fire in his master's room one last time before retiring, and paused at the sight of candlelight, bent head, and steady pen. Not for the first time in 11 months, he thought that his Grace had chosen rather better than either mother or cousin gave him credit for. It was a great pity nobody had thought to tell him so, back when he still would have remembered being told. Outside, the house settled into its usual night sounds. A door somewhere, a dog barking once at the stables and then subsiding, the creak of old wood cooling after a fire banked low. Iris sat a long while in the room that was hers and was not hers, in the house that bore her name now, and had, for one entire day, stopped recognizing her as anything but a stranger standing too close to a sick bed. She understood, with the peculiar clarity that comes only at the end of very long days, that she had a choice to make about what kind of wife she intended to be to a man who did not remember choosing her. Whatever she chose, she would have to choose it without any certainty at all that it would be enough. By the fourth day, Gideon was well enough to be unbearable about being kept in bed, and Dr. Penn, who had seen a great many recovering noblemen and had developed strong opinions about the stubbornness of dukes, finally relented and allowed him downstairs for an hour in the afternoon, provided he did nothing more strenuous than sit in a chair. He did not, strictly speaking, obey the instruction. He walked slowly, one hand trailing along the corridor wall for balance he did not want to admit he needed, through rooms that were his and were not his. Their bones and proportions were familiar, as was the slant of afternoon light through the long windows. Yet every detail that required a memory to explain felt utterly foreign. A vase he did not remember choosing, a dog, elderly and gray-muzzled, that thumped its tail at him from a spot by the library fire as though it had known him its whole life, which it apparently had, and which only made the not remembering worse. In the library, the old gray-muzzled dog had followed him part way before giving up the chase and settling, with a put-upon sigh, back into its spot by the fire. Gideon lingered there a moment longer than necessary, scratching behind its ears and asking, somewhat foolishly, whether it at least remembered him properly. Apparently, no one else in the house was prepared to let him forget how much of himself he'd misplaced. The dog had only leaned into his hand and closed its eyes, entirely unbothered by questions of memory, and Gideon had found that small, uncomplicated loyalty more comforting than anything Dr. Penn or his mother had offered him in 4 days. He found his wife in the small sitting room off her bedchamber, bent over a ledger by the window light, a candle unlit beside her because she did not yet need it, her pen moving in small, economical strokes down a column of figures. She did not hear him in the doorway for a moment, and he stood there longer than was strictly polite, simply watching because there was something in the set of her shoulders, focused, unhurried, entirely without performance. That did not match anything he had been told to expect. "I was under the impression," he said, finally, "that a duchess's principal occupation was to look decorative at dinner and leave the household accounts to a steward." She startled, but only slightly, and turned in her chair with an expression that was already, before she had fully composed it, faintly amused. "Your steward, Your Grace, was rounding sums in his own favor to the tune of nearly £40 a year before I began checking his arithmetic. I have found the work rather more interesting than dinner. 40 pounds. A year. For 3 years before I caught it, which would make it, she did the sum without visible effort. 120 pounds. Though I doubt you'll get all of it back from him now. Gideon lowered himself, carefully, into the chair opposite hers, aware that he had walked further than the doctor intended, and that his head had begun, again, its low, insistent throb. He was aware, too, of a curiosity that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the woman across from him, who had just recited a 3-year sum of household theft, with the same brisk satisfaction another woman might have reserved for a piece of particularly good gossip. "Why does no one mention this?" he said, "when they describe you to me?" Something shuddered, very briefly, in her face. There and gone, so fast he might have imagined it. Because it is not, generally, considered an interesting thing to mention about a duchess. Most people would rather discuss my dowry, or the lack of one, or how quickly the arrangement was made, or whether I am after your money, which I understand has been suggested at least twice at dinner parties I was not invited to. He had not been told this. He filed it away, along with a small, unexpected flare of something that felt oddly like protectiveness for a stranger he had apparently married. "Are you?" he asked. "After my money?" It was, he understood even as he said it, a monstrously rude question. He watched it land on her the way his earlier question had landed, not as an accusation exactly, but as a door he had opened without checking what was behind it. She did not flinch this time, though. She set down her pen with great precision and looked at him directly, and something in her stillness reminded him, faintly and without explanation, of the way she had stood in the doorway on the first day, absorbing his cruelty without complaint and giving nothing back but composure. "I married you," she said, "because my father died leaving debts he had hidden from everyone, including, I think, himself. And because a marriage to you solved a problem I could not have solved any other way. I have never pretended otherwise to you or to anyone. I do not know what you were told, in the part of your life you no longer have, about why you offered for me. I only know what I told you, which was the truth, and which I am telling you again now, because you have no memory of my having told you the first time, and it seems unfair to make you take it on faith." It was, Gideon thought, one of the most honest things anyone had said to him since he had woken. More honest, certainly, than his mother's careful management. More honest than the physician's careful hedging about what he might or might not recover. There was no plea in it, no attempt to soften herself into someone more obviously sympathetic. Only a flat, unflinching account of a transaction, offered without apology, from a woman who plainly expected he might use it against her, and had decided to give it to him anyway. "You correct the household accounts by candlelight," he said slowly. "And you tell a man who cannot remember marrying you that you married him to solve a problem, without once asking him to feel sorry for you about it. Would it help if I asked?" "No," he said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it, and that something in his chest had shifted very slightly, in a direction he did not have the memory to explain, and did not, in that moment, particularly want explained. "No, I don't think it would. I think I find I would rather trust the version of things you're not asking me to feel sorry about." She looked at him for a long moment, something cautious and unguarded, moving behind her eyes at once, as though she did not quite trust the small warmth in the room and did not want to be the one to name it in case naming it made it disappear. He found himself, absurdly, wanting to reach across the small distance between their two chairs. Not for any reason he could have justified to Dr. Penn, or to his mother, or to himself. Only because something in her attention felt, despite every logical objection his memory could not supply. Like coming home to a room he recognized after all. He did not reach. The door opened first. "Gideon!" His mother's voice, from the threshold, carried a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You were told to rest, not to hold court in your wife's sitting room." The moment closed like a hand. Iris was on her feet before he had fully registered his mother's presence, the ledger already gathering itself shut under her fingers, her face rearranging itself into the careful neutrality he was coming to recognize as her armor. Gideon watched it happen, watched her fold herself back into smallness in the space of a single breath, and felt, for the first time since waking into a life he did not remember choosing, a flicker of something close to anger on someone else's behalf. "I was resting," he said to his mother, mildly, though his eyes did not leave Iris. "Sitting, as instructed. I found the company better than the bed." Beatrice's mouth thinned, but she said nothing further in front of the servant hovering behind her with a tray, only inclined her head and waited, with visible patience, for him to rise and follow her out. He did, because his legs had begun, honestly, to shake with the effort of the afternoon. And because there would be time, he told himself, climbing the stairs on his mother's arm, to return to that small sitting room and finish whatever it was that had just begun there. He did not yet know how little time his mother intended to allow him. Rupert Aldrich arrived on the 6th day, with a bottle of good brandy under one arm and an expression of such convincing concern that even Gideon, who did not remember him well enough to have formed an opinion either way, found himself faintly touched by the trouble his cousin had taken to come. "I came the moment I heard," Rupert said, settling himself into the chair by the library fire with the easy familiarity of a man who had sat there a great many times before. He was a handsome man, fair where Gideon was dark, with the kind of open, agreeable face that made strangers trust him within minutes of meeting him. A fact Gideon had apparently once found useful, if the warmth in Rupert's greeting was any indication, since he had been told, by his mother, that the two of them had been close as boys, and closer still since Gideon's father died. "God, Gideon, a fence line. After everything you survived at university, I always thought it would be something grander that finally caught up with you." "Apparently not," Gideon said, and found himself smiling despite the ache still lodged behind his ear, because there was something easy about Rupert's company, something that required nothing complicated of him. No ledgers to be impressed by, no careful honesty to be unsettled by. Only an old friend telling old jokes about old dangers survived. It occurred to him, distantly, that this was the first conversation since waking that had cost him nothing at all, and he found himself grateful for it in a way that surprised him. "How much of the last 3 years do you feature in, exactly? I'm told I'm missing rather a lot of material, and no one has offered me a full accounting yet." Rupert was, as it happened, the closest thing Gideon had to a brother. He was a second cousin on his father's side, raised half a county away, but summered often enough at Caldwick Hall that the two had grown up more like siblings than cousins. They had shared tutors and horses and, later, a certain amount of trouble at university that neither of their mothers had ever fully forgiven. It was a fact of some consequence, though nobody had yet troubled to explain it to Gideon plainly, that Rupert stood next in the line of inheritance after Gideon himself. It was a fact that had never mattered while Gideon was young and unmarried, and presumably expected to produce an heir of his own in the ordinary course of things. But it had taken on a rather different shape in the 11 months since his marriage, and a different shape again in the 6 days since his memory had gone missing along with it. Rupert laughed, but something behind his eyes did not quite laugh with him. More than my share of it, probably, though I doubt you'll thank me for reminding you of most of it. We lost your Uncle Henry the year before last. You'll want to brace yourself for that one. He was fond of you. And there was the business with the northern tenancies, which I helped you sort out, and he paused delicately, swirling the brandy he had not yet been offered a glass for. And there was your marriage, of course, which I understand nobody has fully explained to you either. She has explained it to me. Her father's debts. A convenient arrangement. Ah. Rupert's expression arranged itself into something carefully neutral, sympathetic, unhurried, the face of a man choosing his next words with great care because he cared, evidently, so very much about getting them right. Well, that is one way of describing it, I suppose. Gideon felt the small, cold drop of a stone into still water. Is there another way? I only mean, Rupert said, holding up a placating hand, that I was rather surprised at the time by how quickly the whole thing came together. You'd known Miss Sutherland, Iris, for what, 6 weeks before the banns were read? Perhaps 8. I remember thinking it unlike you. You've never been an impulsive man, Gideon, not in anything that mattered. And then there was the matter of Uncle Henry's will being read that same month, with its rather specific language about the estate wanting a settled and married heir before certain provisions could pass cleanly. I only mention it because if I were in your position, waking without the memory of my own reasoning, I would rather know that there had been reasoning of some kind than assume it had all been sentiment. The library was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, a groom was leading a horse across the frozen yard, its hooves ringing sharp and clean against the cold ground. You are telling me, Gideon said slowly, that I married in haste because of a clause in my uncle's will. I am telling you nothing of the kind. Rupert's face did something practiced and reassuring, the face of a man performing the act of taking something back while leaving every word of it standing exactly where he'd planted it. I'm only telling you what the timing looked like, from where I was standing, and that it is not for me to say what was truly in your heart when you offered for her. Only you could know that, and unfortunately, you no longer do. I only think a man in your position deserves to ask the question, rather than simply accept the kindest version of events, because it is the version he'd prefer to be true. Gideon said nothing for a long moment. He was thinking, unwillingly, of the small sitting room 3 days ago, of the pen moving in economical strokes down a ledger column, of a woman telling him a plain, unflattering truth about her own motives, without once asking him to feel sorry for her. He was thinking, too, that the version of himself who had proposed in haste, whom he could not summon or question or defend, might have had 100 reasons Rupert knew nothing about, or might, just as easily, have been exactly the calculating, will-clause-conscious man Rupert was so gently suggesting he'd been. You'll forgive me, Gideon said finally, if I don't take a man's account of my own motives over my own instincts, even borrowed instincts, 3 years old or not. Of course. Rupert raised his hands again, all easy surrender, and reached at last for the brandy, pouring 2 glasses without being asked, sliding one across to Gideon with the same warm, familiar ease he'd arrived with. I only wanted you to have the full picture, cousin. That's all. A man deserves to know what he's choosing, even the second time around. He raised his glass in a small, private toast and smiled and said, in a tone so light it was almost possible to miss the weight underneath it, "Tell me, Gideon, has anyone thought to ask what happens to the estate and to Henry's provisions if it turns out the marriage doesn't survive the asking twice?" Gideon did not answer. He turned his own glass slowly by its stem, watching the firelight catch and slide across the brandy, and found that the question had lodged itself somewhere behind the ache in his skull, refusing to be set down. He thought of Iris's face when she had told him about her father's debts, unflinching, offering no plea for his sympathy. He thought of Rupert's easy, practiced warmth, and wondered, with a discomfort he did not examine too closely, how much of that same warmth had been aimed at him 100 times before, over 100 glasses of brandy, in the 3 years he could no longer recall well enough to know whether he had ever found it as effortless as he found it now. "I hadn't thought to ask," he said finally, which was true, and which was also, he understood even as he said it, not quite an answer to anything Rupert had actually asked him. Iris did not learn what had passed between Gideon and his cousin in the library that evening. No one thought to tell her, and she did not think to ask, having spent the afternoon in the linen room settling a dispute between 2 maids that had somehow escalated to the point of tears over a missing pillowcase. But at dinner she noticed that Gideon was quieter than he had been in the sitting room 3 days before. He watched her across the table with an expression she could not place, neither the blank courtesy of the first day, nor the easy warmth of their conversation over the ledger. It was something in between, the look of a man turning over a question he had not decided whether to ask. He did not ask it. He excused himself early, pleading a headache that was probably genuine, and Iris was left at the table with Beatrice, who ate her soup in a silence so pointed it felt almost like conversation. Iris did not ask what Rupert had said to put that look on her husband's face, and Beatrice, for once, did not volunteer it, though she watched Iris with a new, assessing attention across the candlelight, as if recalculating some earlier sum and not yet certain of the answer. Iris spent the following 2 days as she had spent most of the 11 months before them, usefully and without display, keeping the household running in the unglamorous way that nobody thanked a duchess for, and everybody noticed the moment it stopped. She settled the matter of the pillowcase. She wrote to the wool merchant about a delayed delivery. She sat with Gideon for an hour each afternoon, at Dr. Penn's cautious encouragement, reading to him from the newspaper while he rested his eyes, and asked her once, without much weight to the question, whether she had always read the political columns aloud in that same dry, amused voice, as though she found the whole business of Parliament faintly ridiculous. She said she had. He said he was glad some things, apparently, did not change. It was 2 days later, in the quiet hours of a gray afternoon when the house had settled into the hush of everyone occupied elsewhere, that Iris went looking for a spare key to the estate office and found herself instead in a conversation she had not planned to have. She had gone to Mrs. Whitlow's small parlor off the kitchen passage, where the housekeeper kept the household keys on a board behind her writing desk, and found Mrs. Whitlow and Simon Brady there together, heads bent over a pot of tea in the easy, unguarded posture of 2 old servants who had worked in the same house long enough to have stopped performing for each other. They did not hear her at the door immediately. "Asked me 3 times if I thought lavender was too plain a scent for a wedding bouquet, Mrs." Whitlow was saying, with the fondness of someone recounting a memory she had turned over many times before. "3 times, mind, as if I hadn't already told him twice it would do beautifully. Never seen a man fuss so over a detail nobody but the bride would notice. He fussed over the ring, too, Simon said, smiling into his tea. Sent it back to the jeweler twice. Said the setting wasn't right, though I couldn't for the life of me tell you what was wrong with it the first time round. I've dressed that man for 6 years, and I never saw him take that much trouble over anything that wasn't a horse. It wasn't like him at all, Mrs. Whitlow agreed. Not the arrangement of it anyway. Quick, everyone said. Practical, they said, on account of her circumstances. But quick isn't the same as careless, is it? And I never saw a man go about a careless thing, so... She stopped because she had finally seen Iris in the doorway, and her face did the thing faces do when they realize a private conversation has just become considerably less private. Your Grace. Mrs. Whitlow was on her feet at once, tea forgotten, the keys already being located with brisk, deflecting efficiency. Forgive us. We didn't hear you come in. You'll be wanting the office key, I expect. Please, Iris said, and heard her own voice come out smaller than she intended. Please don't stop on my account. But they had already stopped, the way a clock stops when someone notices it has been running fast and misses. Whitlow found the key with unnecessary speed and pressed it into Iris's hand, and the moment closed over as neatly as if it had never opened at all. Iris took the key. She thanked them. She did not, in the end, ask the question sitting directly behind her teeth. She did not say, plainly, "What were you talking about? Tell me about the ring. Tell me about the lavender. Tell me what you mean by careless." Some old instinct warned that if she asked too eagerly, she might frighten the answer away entirely, the way one frightens a bird by reaching for it too quickly. She went to the estate office instead and unlocked the door, and stood for a long moment in the cold, unused room without quite remembering why she had come. Quick isn't the same as careless. She turned the phrase over as she might turn over an unfamiliar coin, looking for the mint mark, the proof of where it had come from. She had always understood her marriage in the plainest possible terms. A transaction dressed, out of kindness, in the ordinary rituals of courtship, because a man of Gideon's position could hardly propose to a penniless gentry girl over a business letter. And so there had been a ring, and a proposal, and a wedding with flowers in it, all of it perfectly correct and perfectly, she had assumed, perfunctory. She had told herself in the 11 months since that his small attentions afterward, the flowers he sometimes had cut for her rooms, the way he asked, every evening without fail, how her day had gone and seemed to actually want the answer, were simply the natural courtesy of a decent man making the best of an arrangement he had not truly chosen for its own sake. But a man fussing 3 times over the scent of a wedding bouquet, nobody but the bride would notice, did not sound, to her ear, like a man making the best of things. It sounded like something else, something she did not have a category for yet. She had spent 11 months refusing to build one, out of a fear she had never examined closely enough to name. If she let herself believe it had been more than convenience and then discovered she was wrong, that mistake would be far harder to survive than the plain, manageable grief of believing she had known the truth all along. She thought, too, of Rupert Aldrich's carriage in the drive 2 days past, and of the silence that had followed him into the house and never fully lifted. With a small, uneasy turn of her stomach, she wondered whether the 2 things were connected at all, or whether she was simply a woman so unused to being told anything good about herself that she had begun inventing complications where none existed. She stood in the cold office a long while, the key still warm from Mrs. Whitlow's hand, and asked herself, for the first time in 11 months, a question she had been careful never to ask before. What if I have had the whole of it wrong from the very beginning? Beatrice waited until Rupert had gone. 3 days of comfortable brandy and measured conversation had left Gideon quieter each evening, and Iris more certain that something was being decided in rooms she was not invited into. One gray morning, Beatrice came to her son's study and closed the door behind her with the soft click of a woman who did not want to be overheard by servants. "I am not going to pretend I have no opinion," she said, without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. "You know I never do. So I will simply say it plainly, and you may be as angry with me as you like afterward, provided you hear me first." Gideon set down his pen. He had been attempting, without much success, to make sense of correspondence that referred to arrangements he had no memory of making, and he found he had little appetite left for delicacy. "Say it then." "You are a man who has been given an extraordinarily rare gift," Beatrice said, "though I doubt anyone has put it to you in those terms. Most people live their whole lives never getting to examine a decision with clear eyes, after the fact, once all the urgency and sentiment of the moment has burned away. You have that chance now. You can look at this marriage as it actually is, unclouded by whatever persuaded you into it the first time. You can ask yourself honestly whether it is the marriage you would choose today, for its own sake, if no one had ever asked you to choose it before. And you believe I would not choose it. I believe, Beatrice said, that you married in considerable haste during a difficult season to a woman of no fortune, no connections of consequence, and no ability to bring anything to this family beyond her own good management, which I grant you she has proven capable of. I believe Henry's will made the timing convenient in ways that may or may not have influenced you, and which you are no longer able to weigh for yourself. And I believe that a man recovering from an injury of this severity owes it to himself and to this family to consider whether the kindest thing to everyone, including her, might be to end an arrangement that was never given the chance to be anything more than an arrangement, before more time passes, and it becomes crueler to end than to continue. She said it gently. That was, Gideon thought later, the worst part. None of what she said was technically a lie, and every word arrived wrapped in the appearance of concern. He had no memory with which to argue. He had only the stubborn sense that the woman his mother described, calculating, opportunistic, a fortune seeker disguised as a capable wife, did not match the woman who had sat across a ledger from him 3 days ago and volunteered an unflattering truth she had no reason to expect he'd believe. But a feeling was not a memory. The distinction followed him out of the room. "What would you have me do?" he asked, specifically. "Speak to Whitfield." His mother's solicitor was a reserved, colorless man Gideon vaguely recalled from some prior context he could not place. "Simply to understand your position, what can be undone and what cannot, and at what cost to whom. That is all I am asking, not a decision. Only information, so that whatever you decide it with your eyes open rather than out of sentiment for a woman you met, by any honest account, only 11 months ago." Put that way, it sounded reasonable. Information was not commitment, and understanding his position was not the same as ending his marriage. Gideon repeated the distinction to himself over the following 2 days. It never made the thought of Whitfield feel any lighter. He avoided the small sitting room during those 2 days. Dr. Penn had recommended rest and limited exertion, which gave him an excuse good enough to use and weak enough to recognize. The truth was simpler. He was avoiding Iris. Sitting across a ledger from her again would mean testing his mother's warnings against the woman in front of him before Whitfield had answered anything. So Gideon took his meals earlier than usual and found reasons to be occupied whenever their paths crossed. Iris had no way to know that his distance came from confusion rather than decision. He wrote to Whitfield. He did not tell Iris he had done so. The letter took him longer than it should have. He drafted the first lines twice, discarded both attempts, and finally forced himself into the dry language of property, obligations, and possible remedies. Nothing on the page admitted that the question had a face, or that the face belonged to a woman who read Parliament aloud as though it were a private joke. When he sealed the envelope, he left it on the corner of his desk for nearly an hour before ringing for Simon. By then, the wax had gone cold beneath his thumb, and the decision still felt no more settled than when he had begun. He did not mean it as cruelty. He told himself, writing the letter, that he was protecting her from a conversation that might come to nothing, that there was no purpose in frightening her over information he had not yet received and might never act on. But a house the size of Caldwick Hall keeps very few secrets from the people who run its household accounts. 2 mornings later, Iris checked the outgoing post out of the same habit that had once caught a thieving steward. She saw the letter's direction in Simon's neat hand before it left the house, and understood, in a single glance, everything her husband had not found the courage to tell her himself. For a moment, she simply held the packet above the tray. Whitfield's name was ordinary ink on ordinary paper, yet it seemed to alter the weight of everything around it. The breakfast bell sounding somewhere beyond the passage, the maid waiting with a basket of linen, the list of coal deliveries folded beneath Iris's hand. She put the letter back exactly where she had found it. No one looking at the tray afterward could have known it had changed anything. Iris knew better. She did not confront him. Twice she stood outside his study door with her hand raised to knock, and twice she lowered it. If he had wanted her to know, she thought, he would have told her. Asking now might only give him the chance to offer some gentle, unbearable version of the truth designed to spare her feelings, and she did not think she could bear hearing it dressed as kindness. Instead, she went to her sitting room and sat with the ledger open in front of her without writing anything in it, and allowed herself, for perhaps the first time since the accident, to simply sit with how much it hurt. It was not the debt-repaying gratitude kind of hurt she had braced herself for on the first day. This was sharper, shaped by the afternoon over the ledger, and by the warmth in his eyes when he'd said he would rather trust the version of things she wasn't asking him to feel sorry about. Despite every precaution, she had begun to hope. Now, a solicitor's letter sat somewhere in Whitfield's chambers in town, working out what might become of her marriage, and her husband had not thought her worth telling. She did not cry. She had promised herself on the very first day, standing in his bedchamber with her knuckles white around a chair arm, that whatever happened in this house, she would not be the woman who wept and begged to be kept. She had watched enough of her own mother's marriage in the years before her father's debts had finally caught up with all of them, to know exactly what it looked like when a woman spent her dignity trying to convince a man to want her, and how little it ever purchased. She closed the ledger. She sat a long while in the darkening room, watching the last gray light go out of the window, and made herself a private promise. Not a plan to fight for him or win him back, only a steadying vow that she would not beg. Whatever he decided about the solicitor and the marriage he could not remember choosing, he would have to come to her with it. She would not spend her dignity trying to force an answer from him. She found him 4 days later in the orangery, the one room in the house he had told her long before the accident, where he went when he wanted to think without an audience. He was sitting among the winter bare lemon trees with a book open on his knee that he did not appear to be reading. When he looked up, guilt and relief crossed his face in an uneasy mixture. During the 4 days since discovering the letter, hurt had hardened into something more useful: resolve. Iris was tired of waiting to be told what she was. She kept to the routines of the house because routine gave her hands something to do, while her mind worked elsewhere. She signed the butcher's account, approved the replacement of a cracked pane in the west corridor, and answered Mrs. Whitlow's questions with such normality that the housekeeper watched her twice as closely as usual. Once, Iris and Gideon passed each other at the turn of the main staircase. He stopped as though he meant to speak. She did too. Neither managed it before a footman appeared below them, and the moment dissolved into courtesy. For 11 months, other people's silences had shaped her understanding of the marriage. Now, a solicitor's letter she had never been shown was shaping her fear. By the 4th morning, she understood that waiting had become its own form of surrender. If Gideon was going to decide against her, he would decide against the whole of her, plainly stated, not against the version his mother or cousin had constructed in her absence. Iris had rehearsed nothing. She had told herself, walking down from her sitting room, that rehearsed words always sounded rehearsed, and that whatever she said would matter more for being true than for being polished. She stood a little way off, near the cold glass, and said the thing outright, the way she had said the thing about her father's debts, because honesty was the only currency she had left that she trusted. "I know about the letter to Mr. Whitfield," she said. "I saw the direction before it left the house. I am not angry that you wrote it. You are entitled to understand your own position, and I would not ask you to stay in a marriage you cannot remember choosing simply because it is inconvenient for me to lose it. But I am asking you not to decide anything about us based on what your mother believes I am, or on whatever your cousin has been insinuating to you in private. And I can only guess at what that was from the silence that settled over this house the moment he arrived, and has not entirely lifted since, without once asking me directly. You have not asked me a single question about the last 11 months that I have not offered first. If you are going to decide what kind of woman you married, I would ask that you at least gather your own evidence." Gideon closed the unread book slowly. "You've noticed I've been keeping my distance?" "I have." "It wasn't—" He started and stopped and started again, more honestly. "I told myself it was caution. I am beginning to suspect it was cowardice instead. It is easier to avoid a question than to sit with someone and risk discovering I like the answer more than I trust it." It was the first entirely unguarded thing he had said to her since waking, and Iris found she had to look away from him for a moment, out through the cold glass at the gray garden, before she trusted her own composure enough to answer. "I am not going to ask you to remember loving me," she said. "I don't think that is a fair thing to ask of anyone, and I have had 11 months to learn that a person cannot be persuaded backward into a feeling they no longer have access to. But I would ask you this: whatever you decide about the solicitor, about the marriage, about whatever your mother is steering you toward, decide it about the woman standing in front of you now. Decide it about the woman correcting your household accounts and reading you the newspaper in a voice you apparently find dryly amusing. Not about an account of the last 3 years assembled secondhand by people with their own reasons for telling it the way they tell it. I am not going to beg you to keep me. I have some pride left, even now, but I would ask you not to let me go without ever once actually looking at me. The orangery was still. Somewhere beyond the glass, a gardener's boy was clearing dead leaves from the path, the scrape of his rake the only sound in the whole gray afternoon. "I have been looking at you," Gideon said finally, and his voice had lost the measured, considering quality it had carried since his mother's visit to his study, replaced by something rawer and more immediate. "That is rather the trouble, Iris. I have been looking at you for days, and everything I see contradicts everything I am told. I have not had the courage to say so outright until this moment. Putting it into words means admitting that I do not actually know whom to trust. My own mother, who has never lied to me in my life, or my own eyes, which have no memory to draw on, and might simply be inventing whatever they want to see." "Then trust what you contest," Iris said. "Ask your own questions. Look at what is actually in front of you, rather than what you're told was in front of you 3 years ago." He was silent for a long moment, turning the closed book over in his hands. When he spoke again, something in his posture had changed. Some decision arrived at, however tentative, however unfinished. "My mother has arranged a family assembly," he said, "the week after next. Ostensibly to mark my recovery. Half the county will be there, and Rupert besides. And I suspect rather more scrutiny of this marriage than either of us will enjoy. She proposed delicately that it might be simplest if you were indisposed that evening, that I attend alone, while matters are unsettled." Iris felt something in her chest go very still, bracing for the rest of it. "I told her," Gideon said, "not an hour before you found me here, that I would attend with my wife, or not at all. I do not yet know what I have decided about anything else, Iris. I want to be honest with you about that much, at least, since you have been honest with me. But I find I am no longer willing to let anyone else decide, on my behalf, who stands beside me in my own house." Iris let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and something in her shoulders braced for 4 days against a blow she had not been sure would land, eased by some small degree. She did not reach for him. She was not, she thought, entirely ready to trust the ground under either of them yet. But she came and sat on the bench beside him, among the bare lemon trees, close enough that their sleeves nearly touched, and said nothing further for a while, and found that the silence between them, for the first time in days, did not feel like distance. It was not a declaration, nor did it settle everything that had frightened her for 4 days. But it was a choice made openly, in daylight, without his mother's guidance. The first Iris had seen him make entirely on his own since the accident took the rest of his certainty away. For the moment, among the bare lemon trees in the cold gray afternoon, it was enough. The assembly rooms at Caldwick Hall had not been opened for a gathering of this size in over a year. Standing at Gideon's side as the first carriages arrived, Iris found herself grateful for the small, absorbing tasks of hostessing, the receiving line, the introductions, the management of which elderly relation needed a chair near the fire, and which needed to be kept well away from which other elderly relation. It left less room in her mind for the fear that had been circling since the invitations went out. Half the county came, as Gideon had predicted, drawn equally by genuine concern for his recovery and by the considerably less charitable curiosity of wanting to see, with their own eyes, how the Duke of Rothermere, was managing a marriage he could no longer remember contracting. Iris felt their eyes on her all evening, measuring, assessing, the attention reserved for a woman whose position in a great house had suddenly become, in the space of a single accident, a matter of open speculation. Gideon seemed to notice it too. More than once, when a guest allowed a question to hover too near the edge of insult, he shifted half a step closer to Iris before answering, never theatrically, and never enough to invite remark. The gesture was so small that anyone else might have missed it. Iris did not. By the time the servants carried away the last of the dinner things, she had begun to understand that his promise in the orangery had not been made merely to comfort her. She bore it well. She had spent 11 months learning how to bear that kind of attention, ever since her hasty, convenient marriage had first set the county's tongues moving. And she found that the skill, at least, had not deserted her even as everything else about her position had grown so uncertain. Gideon stayed close to her side through most of the evening, more attentive than strictly necessary, and she understood it for what it was, not performance, but a kind of quiet, deliberate answer to whatever his mother had hoped the evening would prove instead. It was Rupert who finally forced the question into the open, and he chose his moment with the precision of a man who had been waiting for it all night. The drawing room had filled with the after-dinner crush of a large assembly, knots of conversation, the clink of glasses, a string quartet doing its determined best to be heard over all of it, when Rupert raised his voice. He was not shouting, but he spoke with the deliberate, carrying clarity of a man who wanted to be overheard by exactly the right number of people. "I only ask," he said, to a small cluster that included two of the county's more notorious gossips and, not incidentally, the Dowager Duchess. "Because I care about my cousin, and because I think it is a fair question, given the circumstances. Has anyone actually established whether Gideon is capable, in his present condition, of properly consenting to remain in a marriage he does not recall entering into? It seems to me a matter that ought to concern the family, and frankly, the estate, rather more than it appears to be concerning anyone at present." The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way water goes still after a stone breaks the surface. First, the immediate circle, then a widening ring of conversation dying away as heads turned, until by the time Gideon crossed the room toward his cousin, a good third of the assembly had stopped pretending not to listen. "Say what you mean plainly, Rupert," Gideon said, and his voice, though quiet, carried in the new stillness with the authority of a man who had spent his whole life being listened to the moment he chose to speak. "You have circled this question in my study, in my library, and now in my own drawing room in front of my guests. I would rather you simply say the thing you have clearly come here tonight to say." Rupert's easy, agreeable face did something Iris had not seen it do before. A brief, unguarded flash of something harder underneath the warmth, there and gone so quickly that she might have doubted she'd seen it at all, if she had not spent the last 11 months learning to read the small tells beneath performed feeling. "Very well. I mean that a man who cannot remember why he married, who cannot vouch for his own judgment 3 years ago, has every right, indeed, every obligation to himself and to this family. To have that marriage reviewed before he commits himself to it a second time, out of nothing more than habit and the discomfort of an awkward conversation. I mean that it would be a great deal easier to have this discussion honestly now, among family, than to have it played out in the courts later. Or worse, to have you simply drift back into an arrangement you never actually chose for yourself, because no one had the courage to ask the question while there was still time to answer it cleanly. "And what would you have me do?" Gideon said, specifically in front of my assembled guests on this particular evening. "I would have you be honest," Rupert said. And here, for the first time, something almost pleading entered his voice. Some genuine feeling beneath the calculation. Though whether it was feeling for Gideon or for the inheritance clause in Henry's will, Iris could not have said with any certainty. "Tell them, Gideon. Tell this room whether you can, in good conscience, say you know this marriage was ever more than convenience. That it was not simply the fastest, most practical solution available to a man who needed a settled household before an inheritance clause closed, and a woman who needed rescuing from her father's debts. Tell them you know it was more than that. If you can say it outright in front of everyone here, I will never raise the question again." It was, Iris understood, a trap built with genuine skill. Because Gideon could not say it. He had no memory to draw on, no certainty to offer beyond a feeling a month old, formed over ledgers and newspaper columns, and one honest conversation in an orangery. Rupert had constructed the question so precisely that any hesitation at all would read, to a room full of watching county gossips, as confirmation of exactly the calculation he was describing. The silence stretched. Iris felt every eye in the room shift toward her husband, felt her own held breath sit painfully in her chest, and understood, with a terrible, falling clarity, that whatever Gideon said next would be repeated at every dinner table in the county by morning, regardless of whether it was true. Gideon did not look away from his cousin. He crossed the last few feet of space between them, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped low enough that the whole room had to lean in, unconsciously, to catch it. "I cannot tell you I remember it," he said. "You are quite right about that, and I will not stand here and pretend otherwise to satisfy an audience. I do not have the memory you are asking me to produce. But I will tell you what I do have, Rupert, since you have asked me to be honest in front of everyone I know." He turned, then, deliberately, and found Iris across the room. Found her the way a man finds a fixed point in a storm, Iris thought later, though in the moment she registered only the sudden, overwhelming weight of every eye in the room following his to land on her. "I have watched this woman correct a household ledger by candlelight and refuse to ask for anyone's pity while doing it," Gideon said. "I have watched her tell me the plainest, least flattering version of her own circumstances, without once softening it to win my sympathy. I have watched her hold this house together for a week while I could not remember 3 years of my own life, and I have watched her refuse, twice that I know of, to leave when leaving would have been considerably easier for everyone, including her. I do not need 3 years of memory to know what kind of woman that is. I have a month's evidence, gathered with my own eyes. I find I trust it considerably more than I trust anyone's account of what I might have felt before I had the chance to see her clearly for myself." He paused, and the whole drawing room held with him, the string quartet, finally, belatedly, faltering into silence. "I do not have proof of what I felt 3 years ago," Gideon said. "I may never have it. But I am telling you, and everyone in this room, that I do not need it. I choose this marriage today, on the evidence available to me today, freely, and without anyone else's permission to do so." No one spoke. Somewhere near the back of the room, a glass was set down on a table with a small, unbearably loud click, and still no one spoke. The entire assembly suspended in the particular silence that follows a man staking his whole reputation on a single, unproven sentence, in front of everyone who would remember, whatever happened next, that he had said it. Beatrice Vane stood very still near the fireplace, her composed face, for once, entirely unreadable, even to a son who had spent 31 years learning to read it. Rupert's easy warmth had gone somewhere else entirely, replaced by a careful blankness that gave away nothing, and, in giving away nothing, gave away rather more than he perhaps intended. And Iris, standing alone in the middle of a room full of people who had all, in the space of one held breath, turned to look at her, found that she could not, for the length of several long seconds, remember how to do anything at all except stand very still and let herself, finally, be seen. It was Simon who told him, 2 days after the assembly, in the simple, unhurried way of a man who had decided that loyalty to his master's happiness mattered rather more than loyalty to his master's privacy. "There's a drawer in the estate desk you've never had cause to open since your accident, Your Grace," Simon said, laying out the evening's clothes with his usual precision and avoiding Gideon's eye. "Bottom left, behind the ledgers. It's kept locked, though I don't imagine you'll find the key far. You kept it in your waistcoat pocket most days, the year before your marriage. I only mention it because I've said more than I ought already these past weeks, keeping quiet about things that weren't mine to tell. I find I'd rather risk your displeasure for speaking than go on watching you search for answers everyone in this house already has, and none of us has the standing to hand you directly." Gideon found the key that evening, exactly where Simon had said it would be, in a small carved box on his dressing table that he had walked past 100 times without curiosity. The drawer stuck slightly with disuse before it gave, and inside, beneath a stack of old estate correspondence he did not trouble to examine, lay a slim-bound notebook and a small bundle of letters tied with plain string. His own handwriting on the outermost page, dated some 17 months back, well before the wedding, well before any talk of debts or convenient arrangements at all. He sat down at the desk to read, because his legs did not entirely trust themselves to hold him standing, and because some instinct told him this was not a discovery to be made on his feet. The early entries were unremarkable, notes on tenant disputes, a line or two about a horse he was considering purchasing, the ordinary accumulated debris of a busy man's private thoughts. It was the entry dated the 4th of October that changed everything, and Gideon read it twice through before he trusted himself to have understood it correctly the first time. "Met Miss Sutherland again this evening at the Ashworth dinner, the 3rd time now in as many months, though I have contrived each meeting to look like chance, which I suspect fools no one but myself. She corrected Lord Ashworth's arithmetic at table, gently, without seeming to notice she had done anything remarkable, and I found I could not stop thinking of it for the rest of the evening. I am aware this is becoming a habit I ought to examine more honestly than I have allowed myself to examine it thus far." There were more entries after that, weeks of them, tracking a courtship Gideon had apparently conducted almost entirely in secret, watching her from a discreet distance, learning what he could of her situation through discreet inquiry rather than direct approach. One entry, dated a fortnight after the first, recorded an evening at the theater where he had contrived to be seated 2 rows behind her party for the sole purpose, by his own admission, of watching her laugh at a line the rest of the box had missed entirely. Another, shorter, simply read, "Bought her nothing today. Told myself it was restraint. It was, in fact, cowardice. dressed as restraint, which I am coming to recognize as a pattern in myself I do not entirely admire. It was the entry from early December, 3 lines only, that made Gideon set the notebook down and press the heel of his hand hard against his eyes before he could go on. Learned today, from her mother's cousin, the full extent of Sutherland's debts. Understood at once what I had somehow failed to understand before, that if I go to her honestly, as a man courting a woman he has fallen in love with, she will never be able to say yes to me without wondering, for the rest of her life, whether she said it out of gratitude rather than choice. She has too much pride to accept rescue dressed as romance. So I find I must dress the romance as rescue instead, and hope she never has cause to look too closely at which one it actually was. The letters that followed the notebook confirmed the rest of it. They were in Gideon's own familiar hand, drafted and redrafted, most of them never sent. They seemed to be practice for the proposal he had eventually made, each draft moving a little closer to the deliberately plain, practical language he finally used. Across a dozen attempts, he had stripped out every word that might have betrayed how much more than convenience the arrangement actually was. I want her to be able to say yes without feeling she owes me anything for it. Read one crossed-out margin note in handwriting pressed hard enough to nearly tear the page. I would rather she marry me, believing it costs her nothing, than watch her spend the rest of her life trying to repay a debt of feeling she never agreed to owe. A final scrap of paper, folded separately from the rest and pressed flat inside the back cover, turned out to be a florist's note in an unfamiliar hand, confirming an order for lavender with a single line added beneath it in Gideon's own writing. Third time, asking. She would laugh at me for the fussing if she ever knew of it. Let her never know of it. Let her only ever have to believe the bouquet was simple, because simple was all I was permitted to give her, without frightening her off entirely. Gideon thought of Mrs. Whitlow's fond, careful recollection in the kitchen parlor, 3 times, mind, as if I hadn't already told him twice, and understood, with a fresh and painful clarity, how close the truth had been standing beside Iris for weeks in the mouths of people too loyal to say it outright. Gideon sat a long while with the notebook open on his knee in a study that had, for the first time since the accident, stopped feeling like a stranger's room. He understood now the fuss over the lavender, the twice-returned ring, the 11 months of small, unshowy attentions his mother had dismissed as the ordinary courtesy of a decent man managing an arrangement. He understood, too, with a fresh and considerable ache, exactly how thoroughly his own carefully engineered kindness had backfired, how the very effort he had made to spare Iris the burden of gratitude had also, without either of them intending it, robbed her of the one thing that might have let her believe, these past 11 months, that she was loved rather than merely rescued. He found her in the small sitting room, where he had somehow known, without quite deciding to look there first, that she would be. She was not at the ledger this time. She was sitting by the cold hearth with her hands folded in her lap, watching the last gray light fail outside the window, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that had grown over these past strange weeks, entirely familiar to him. Guarded, braced for whatever news he had come to deliver. He did not sit. He crossed the room and knelt instead in front of her chair and held out the notebook, open to the entry dated the 4th of October, and waited while she read it, and watched her face change as she reached the lines about Lord Ashworth's arithmetic. "I didn't marry you because your father died in debt," Gideon said in a low voice, Once he was certain she had read enough to understand what she was holding. I married you because I had already fallen in love with a woman who corrected a peer's sums at dinner, without seeming to notice she'd done anything worth noticing, and because I was too much of a coward to court her honestly, in case she said yes to me only to escape a worse fate. I built the whole arrangement to look like rescue, Iris, so that you would never have to wonder whether you owed me your feelings in return for mine. I did it to protect you from a debt I never wanted you to feel you had to repay. And I think, reading this tonight, that it may be the single greatest mistake I have made in a life I otherwise cannot even fully remember. Because I spent 11 months making certain you never had to feel grateful to me. And in doing it, I never once let you know you were loved. Iris did not answer him at once. She took the notebook from his hands as though it might still change its mind about what it contained. She read the entry about Lord Ashworth's dinner a second time, and then a third. Gideon remained on the sitting room floor and let her take whatever time she needed, because 11 months of self-protection did not unmake themselves in the space of a single revelation, however plainly stated. You let me believe I was a solution to a problem, she said finally, and her voice was unsteady. For 11 months. You let your own mother believe it. You let me believe it about myself every single day, and never once thought to simply tell me the truth and let me decide what to do with it. I know, Gideon said. I am not going to defend it as anything other than what it was, a mistake, made out of love, which does not make it any less a mistake. I can only tell you that I am not the man who made that decision anymore, not entirely, and that the man kneeling in front of you now would rather risk you knowing exactly how much you are loved and choosing accordingly than spend one more day protecting you from a debt of feeling that was never a debt at all. It was only ever a gift. I would like the chance to give it to you properly this time, if you'll let me. She looked at him a long while in the fading light of the sitting room, and Gideon understood that whatever she said next would matter, rather more than anything Rupert had asked of him in front of the whole assembled county. But when she finally reached out and took his hand, drawing him up from the floor beside her, she did not say anything at all, only held on, tightly, in the particular silence of two people who had run out of things that needed explaining and had arrived, at last, at the plainer business of simply choosing to stay. They were married again in April, in the small stone chapel at the edge of the Caldwick grounds, though neither of them ever called it a second wedding aloud, preferring instead to think of it as the same marriage continued, a private ceremony this time, deliberately small, with only the household and a handful of family in attendance, and no announcement sent to the county papers at all. Iris wore lavender in her hair, at Gideon's insistence, and did not ask him why until afterward, when he told her, and she laughed exactly the way his old journal had once predicted she would, and did not mind the fussing in the slightest. Mrs. Whitlow cried through the whole of it unashamedly, and told anyone who would listen afterward that she had known, all along, precisely how it would end, which was not entirely true, but which nobody in the household had the heart to correct her on. Simon stood near the back with an expression of profound, silent satisfaction, the particular pride of a man who had finally said the thing he'd spent weeks not saying, and watched it land exactly where it needed to. Rupert did not attend. He had returned to his own modest property some weeks before, following a private conversation with Gideon in which very little was said aloud about wills or inheritance clauses, and a great deal was understood regardless. If Rupert nursed any lingering resentment over an estate that would, in the fullness of time, very likely pass to a Rothermere heir of Gideon's own making, rather than to himself, he kept it, for once, entirely to himself. Beatrice Vane stood at the front of the small chapel, in a gown she had chosen with more thought than usual, and watched her son marry his wife a second time. In the weeks since the assembly, her expression had softened into something Iris had never expected to see directed at her. Not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of it. The respect of a woman who had been wrong about someone and had decided, without ceremony, to be wrong about it gracefully. Afterward, in the garden, she took Iris's hands in both of hers and said only, "I am glad my son had the sense to fall in love with you twice," which was, from Beatrice, very nearly an apology, and which Iris chose generously to accept as one. The lemon trees in the orangery had begun, by then, to show their first small green buds. The long winter was finally loosening its hold on Caldwick Hall in the ordinary, unremarkable way that winters eventually do. Standing in the April sunlight with lavender in her hair and her husband's hand in hers, Iris found she no longer needed to wonder which version of her marriage had been the true one. She had been loved, it turned out, from the very beginning. She had simply needed the chance to be shown it twice before she could finally, fully, believe it. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself hoping, right alongside Iris, that the truth would finally come out, this channel is where stories like this one live every week. Give this video a like if Gideon's Journal broke your heart a little. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And tell us in the comments, did you suspect the truth before the notebook, or did it catch you off guard the way it caught Iris? We read every comment, and we can't wait to hear which moment hit you hardest. More stories are coming soon.